For most of recorded history, the Odyssey was read as invention, a poet's fable, composed roughly 2,700 years ago and set in a world 5 centuries older still, populated by one-eyed giants, a sea nymph, and an island of imprisoned winds. The places Odysseus sailed to on his long way home were understood as literature, not geography. There was no reason to look for them on any map. That assumption held for centuries, until people began to dig where the poem said to dig, and the ground answered back. Beneath the myth lay real cities, real harbors, real trade routes, and in one case, the misread bones of animals that had gone extinct long before Greece existed. What archaeologists have pulled from those shores does not confirm a hero's voyage. It does something stranger. It suggests the Odyssey was never pure fantasy, but a real world folded into a story. The story of Odysseus begins after the fall of a city. Troy was, in the poem, a jewel of the ancient world, a walled metropolis brought down by 10 years of war and a wooden horse. For most of the 19th century, serious scholars regarded it as a place that had never existed. Troy was geography borrowed for a story, a name attached to nothing you could stand on. The people who went looking for it were treated as eccentrics, chasing a poem into the hills of northwestern Turkey. One of them was Frank Calvert. He was a British consular official, an amateur by training, and he had lived in the region for years. He read the ancient sources against the landscape in front of him and became convinced that a low mound called Hisarlik, near the mouth of the Dardanelles, was the real Troy. The identification was not entirely his. A Scottish writer named Charles Maclaren had proposed the same mound from the texts alone in 1822 and had been dismissed. Calvert went further. He bought part of the mound, cut trial trenches into it in the early 1860s, and found enough to be certain. He offered his findings to the British Museum. The museum refused him. His own funds ran out before he could reach the layers that mattered. In 1868, Calvert handed the site to a wealthier man. Heinrich Schliemann had the money Calvert lacked and an appetite for fame that Calvert did not. Between 1870 and 1890, Schliemann excavated Hisarlik on a scale Calvert never could have, and when the walls of an ancient citadel emerged from the ground, he took sole credit for finding Homer's Troy. Calvert's name receded into a footnote. He received his due roughly a century after he died. What the excavations exposed rewrote the fable. The mound was not a single city, but a stack of them. 9 distinct layers of settlement, each a version of Troy built, occupied, and destroyed by fire or earthquake, then leveled flat and rebuilt on top of the wreckage. The debris of one city became the foundation of the next, over and over, across thousands of years on the same patch of ground. Reading those layers was like reading a ledger of the site's entire history, pressed into the earth in order. The question that remained was which layer, if any, belonged to Homer's Troy. The Odyssey describes a cultural and economic capital enclosed behind formidable walls, and a poet has every reason to inflate the scale of the city his heroes spent a decade besieging. But the archaeology answered without exaggeration. By the late Bronze Age, the period in which the poem is set, Troy was a substantial fortified citadel with a large settlement spreading below it. The walls were real. The lower town was real. The scale Homer described was not far from what the ground contained. A city that generations of historians had filed under mythology turned out to have foundations stratified 9 deep, exactly where an overlooked amateur said they would be. That is the finding that reframes everything after it. If the war that opens the story was anchored to a real place, then the voyage that follows the war deserves the same scrutiny. Each island Odysseus reaches on his way home becomes a location to be tested rather than a fantasy to be dismissed. The rest of the journey runs south and west from here. across a sea that was already, in Homer's time, thick with real ports and real trade. The next stop is a coast of narcotic flowers. The next land in the poem is gentler than the war that precedes it, and more dangerous for exactly that reason. Driven off course by a northerly wind, Odysseus and his crew reach a coast whose inhabitants live on a single plant. They eat a lotus, and the fruit induces a soft, total forgetfulness. The men who taste it lose all desire to go home. Odysseus has to drag them back to the ships by force. It is a small episode, but it establishes the shape of the whole voyage. Every shore offers a reason to stop, and stopping is the thing that will destroy them. The place has a real candidate, and it was named in antiquity. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing roughly 2,500 years ago, located the lotus-eaters on the North African coast near what is now Tunisia. The island that best fits his account is Djerba in the Gulf of Gabes, a low shore of sand and lagoon that a ship blown south from Troy would plausibly strike. The geography aligns with the trajectory the poem describes. So does the atmosphere. It is the kind of easy, warm coast that could persuade a tired crew to stay. Then there is the archaeology. Excavation on Djerba has uncovered Meninx, an ancient port founded in Punic times on the island's southeastern shore. It was not a village. Meninx became one of the largest cities in Roman North Africa and one of the Mediterranean's principal centers for the production of purple dye, the pigment extracted, shell by shell, from crushed murex sea snails. The mounds of broken shells around the site are the residue of that industry. Purple was among the most valuable substances in the ancient world, and a city built on it was a city plugged into long-distance trade. Its purple clothed the powerful, and a single garment's worth of dye could demand thousands of snails. The scale of that trade was measured directly. Between 2017 and 2018, a joint Tunisian-German project run by the National Heritage Institute in Tunis and the University of Munich surveyed the buried city using magnetometry, a technique that maps structures underground by reading disturbances in the magnetic field without lifting a single stone. The survey traced the street grid and a large market, confirming Meninx as a commercial hub. It also found something the modern coastline hides. Jetties and quays, once part of the working harbor, now sit submerged offshore, drowned by a shifting shore. The port Homer's crew would have needed was there, and part of it is now underwater. The sea had taken back what the city built. The lotus itself is the last piece, and it resolves more plainly than the myth suggests. The dream-inducing flower has a real counterpart in the Sisyphus lotus, the Mediterranean jujube, a thorny shrub native to North Africa that produces a small, sweet fruit tasting somewhere between a date and an apple. Local populations ate it, baked it into bread, and let it ferment. A fruit that sweet carries the sugars needed to ferment into something mildly intoxicating. The forgetfulness in the poem may not be the work of a narcotic bloom at all. It may be the ordinary effect of alcohol, observed on a foreign shore and carried home as wonder. A port, a dye trade, a real fruit with a real name. The land of the lotus-eaters turns out to be a documented city on a specific island, its harbor half sunk beneath the sea. The next island in the sequence demands more than a port to explain. It demands a monster. The next island is where the poem turns from hardship to horror. Odysseus and his crew make land, find a cave stocked with cheese and penned lambs, and wait inside for its owner, trusting the ancient rule that a host feeds a stranger. The owner is Polyphemus, a giant with a single eye in the center of his forehead. He seals the crew inside with a boulder and eats them two at a time. Odysseus escapes only by blinding him with a sharpened stake and slipping out beneath his sheep. As the ship pulls away, The blinded giant hurls rocks after it and curses Odysseus to the sea god Poseidon, his father. The curse is what turns a voyage home into 10 years of wandering. The poem never names the island, but classical tradition placed the Cyclopes on Sicily at the foot of Mount Etna. The logic ran through fire. The Cyclopes were imagined as a forge people tied to Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, and Etna was a mountain that breathed smoke and threw molten rock. A volcano was the obvious home for giants who worked in flame. The volcanic soil around it produced exactly the lush, fertile landscape Homer describes, and the town of Treza sits directly beneath the mountain on the eastern coast. But the deeper explanation is not about volcanoes. It is about bones. Sicily holds some of the richest deposits anywhere of Paleoloxodon falconeri, a dwarf elephant that lived across the Mediterranean islands during the Pleistocene and stood under a meter tall at the shoulder. When one of these animals died, its skull could be preserved in the island's caves and cliffs and later exposed by erosion. And an elephant's skull, seen head-on, does not look like an elephant to someone who has never seen one. The tusks are usually gone. The eye sockets sit low and to the sides, easy to miss. What dominates the front of the skull is a single enormous cavity in the center, the opening that in life anchored the trunk. To an eye with no concept of elephants, it reads as one vast eye socket in the middle of a giant's face. The connection was formally proposed in the early 20th century by the Austrian paleontologist Othenio Abel. His argument was direct. Ancient people found these skulls weathering out of the rock, had no framework of extinct proboscideans to explain them, and built the one-eyed giant from the evidence in front of them. The monster was not invented. It was deduced, correctly assembled, from a real animal and a reasonable mistake. There is a second Sicilian detail, and it is one the myth points to itself. Off the coast at Treza stands a cluster of basaltic sea stacks called the Faraglioni dei Ciclopi, the Isles of the Cyclops. They are columns of volcanic rock, and their composition matches the mainland of Sicily. Local tradition holds that these are the very boulders the blinded Polyphemus tore loose and threw at the fleeing ship. The rocks are real. Their volcanic origin is real, and the story attached to them survives on the coastline as geography. This is where the argument sharpens. The other islands hid real ports beneath the myth. This one hides something stranger. The monster may not be fiction at all, but a real observation of real bones, explained with the only knowledge its finders had. The Odyssey may be carrying fossil evidence forward, encoded as a creature. The next stops loosen further, into places where the archaeology is quieter and the identification rests more on the poem than on the ground. Further into the voyage, after the last of his crew has drowned, Odysseus washes up alone on an island called Ogygia. It is the home of the nymph Calypso, and it is described as a place of impossible perfection, a paradise so complete that even a god arriving there would stop and marvel. Calypso takes him in, nurses him back from ruin, and keeps him. 7 years pass. Homer frames the island not as a reward, but as a trap, a beautiful stasis that Odysseus slowly comes to resent. When the chance to leave finally comes, he turns down the immortality she offers and chooses the mortal life waiting for him at home. The paradise had become a cage. The candidate for Ogygia is Gozo, the second largest island of the Maltese archipelago, and the association is old. Writers in antiquity, including the poet Callimachus in the 3rd century BC, treated Gozo as a mysterious place at the edge of the known world, a navel of the seas. A cave above the red sands of Ramla Bay is still called Calypso's Cave, and it is easy to see how the setting could suggest the shore where Odysseus drifted in, but this identification has to be handled honestly. The link between Gozo and Ogygia runs almost entirely through myth and association, not through excavation. The cave itself is a natural formation, and it is currently closed to visitors because of frequent landslides. There is no dig here that ties the site to the poem. What Gozo does hold is archaeology of a different order, older and stranger than the story that draws people to it. On the island stand the Gyantia temples, a pair of colossal stone structures dated to somewhere between roughly 3,600 and 3,200 BC. They are among the oldest freestanding buildings anywhere on Earth, raised more than 1,000 years before the pyramids of Giza. They were built from limestone blocks of enormous size, some of them weighing over 50 tons, set upright by a Neolithic people with no metal tools and no wheel as we know it. The name is the key. Gantija means the temple of the giants, and it comes from a local belief that no ordinary people could have moved stones on this scale. Only giants could have built it. This is the same instinct at work on the Sicilian coast, a real feature of the landscape explained by inserting a giant into the gap where knowledge was missing. But the archaeology has since closed that gap. Near both temples, researchers found hundreds of small stone spheres worked into rough balls. The working interpretation is that these were used as bearings, rolled beneath the great blocks on tracks or planks so that a few people could shift a 50-ton stone across the ground. The myth of giants encodes a real problem, the moving of impossible weights, and the stone balls are the real answer to it. So Ogygia gives us the weakest link in the sequence, and one of the strongest sites. The connection to Calypso's island is a matter of ancient reputation rather than proven fact, and it may owe as much to tourism as to Homer. But the ground beneath the legend holds a monument that genuinely rewrites expectations of what Neolithic people could do, and a myth of giants that turns out to describe an engineering method rather than a race of monsters. The final stop before Ithaca returns to firmer ground, to a seafaring nation whose harbor the archaeologists have not only found but watched die. The last island before home is where the poem finally offers Odysseus kindness. Leaving Ogygia on a raft he builds himself, he is wrecked one more time by Poseidon and washes ashore on Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians. Here the pattern breaks. The princess Nausicaa finds him and brings him to her parents, the king and queen, who feed him, clothe him, and listen to the full account of his wanderings. Moved by the story, the king gives him a crew and a ship to carry him the last stretch to Ithaca. The Phaeacians are a people defined by the sea, masters of ships said to steer themselves by thought. Their generosity is also their undoing. When Poseidon sees that they have delivered Odysseus home, he turns their returning ship to stone and roots it to the seabed, and the Phaeacians resolve never to ferry a stranger again. The identification of Scheria is one of the better supported in the poem. The candidate is Corfu, known in antiquity as Corcyra, and the case does not rest on atmosphere alone. The historian Thucydides, writing in the 5th century BC, recorded that Corcyra had once been inhabited by the Phaeacians and boasted of their skill at sea. The geography fits the narrative. Corfu lies within a single night's sail of Ithaca, matching the speed of Odysseus's final crossing, yet far enough from the other Ionian islands to read as the remote land the poem describes. Local tradition even names the culprit of Poseidon's curse. The small islet of Ponticonisi, Mouse Island off the Canoni Peninsula, is said to be the petrified Phaeacian ship, fixed in the water on its way back. The archaeology answers the poem's central claim, that Scheria was a true naval power. On the Canoni and Palaeopolis Peninsula lie the remains of the ancient city of Corcyra, which in its own right was one of the 3 great naval states of ancient Greece, ranked alongside Athens and Corinth. The most telling discovery was the ship sheds a complex of long-roofed warehouses built to hold warships out of the water, each of them around 40 meters in length. These are not the works of a coastal village. They are the infrastructure of a state that lived by its fleet, exactly the kind of seafaring nation Homer placed at the edge of the map. Then the ground gave up the end of the story as well as the beginning. In the early 2010s, researchers mapped the entire buried harbor using vibrocoring and geophysical survey, techniques that read the layered sediment beneath the surface without excavation. The map revealed two distinct disruptions in the stratigraphy, breaks in the ordered layers consistent with the impact of tsunamis. If this was the naval heart of ancient Corcyra, it was very likely destroyed by those waves. The survey produced both a full plan of the port and a probable cause of its death, and it did so while the harbor itself remains underground, unexcavated, read entirely through the sediment. So the final island before home is not a myth loosely draped over a coastline. It is a documented naval city with its warship sheds still in the earth and its destruction recorded in the layers beneath it. 5 stops, and each one has yielded a real place, a real trade, or a real explanation. That leaves only the destination itself, the island the whole voyage bends toward. And of all the locations in the poem, the hero's own kingdom is the one that has refused for 200 years to be found. Ithaca is the end of the voyage, the kingdom Odysseus spends 20 years trying to reach, where he returns in disguise to reclaim a palace overrun by men courting his wife. It should be the easiest location to identify. There is an island called Ithaca today off the west coast of Greece, and it even carries a landmark named the Palace of Odysseus. But the certainty dissolves under examination. The location of Homer's Ithaca has been argued for 2 centuries because the poem's own description does not fit the island that bears the name. Odysseus calls his home low-lying, the farthest out to sea, facing the dark of the west while the neighboring islands face the dawn. Modern Ithaca is mountainous, and it sits tucked against the inner coast of Kephallonia, not the farthest out to anything. 2 answers compete. The first stays on modern Ithaca, at a site in the north misleadingly called the School of Homer. A team from the University of Ioannina, led Thanasis Papadopoulos and Litsa Kontorli Papadopoulou, uncovered a Bronze Age complex of buildings on terraces, dated an underground spring to the 13th century BC, and recovered artifacts including a clay tablet. Papadopoulos went as far as to call the site a strong candidate for the Homeric Palace, a claim significant enough that the location now appears on maps as the palace itself. Earlier excavations on the island had turned up bronze coins marked with the word Ithacon of Ithaca, but coins in a disputed complex prove worship, not residence. They show the island honoring the legend, not the man living there. The second answer moves the island entirely. In 2005, the businessman Robert Bittlestone, working with the philologist James Diggle and the geologist John Underhill, argued in a book called Odysseus Unbound that Homer's Ithaca is not Ithaca at all, but Peliki, the western peninsula of Kephallonia. Peliki is low-lying and faces west, matching the poem where Ithaca does not. Bittlestone proposed that Peliki was once a separate island, cut off by a marine channel that has since filled in. He drew support from the geographer Strabo, who wrote of a low isthmus on Kephallonia, so narrow it was often flooded from sea to sea. His team pointed to deep ravines and loose rockfall as the trace of that vanished channel. The theory is elegant, and it has not been accepted. Geologists and classicists have pushed back, and the honest verdict is that the evidence remains circumstantial. There is a plausible former island. There is no palace, no house foundation, nothing yet pulled from the ground that names the place. Bittlestone was an amateur, not a trained archaeologist, and dismissing him for that alone would be a mistake, given how this field began. It was an amateur who found Troy. But an intriguing landscape is not the same as a discovery. and even a confirmed Ithaca would not settle the deepest question. Finding the island would not prove that Odysseus was real. The parallel is King Arthur, a figure surrounded by sites and relics, and no evidence he ever lived, at most a legend grown around some forgotten warlord. The coins, the tablet, the venerated ruins on the Ionian Islands are more likely the residue of hero worship, a people idolizing a character from a poem. They tell us less about a man than about the audience that carried his story for 3,000 years. So the voyage ends where it cannot be closed. The final island refuses identification, the palace remains contested, and the man at the center of it stays out of reach, somewhere between memory and invention, on ground that is still being dug. Place by place, the poem's impossible geography has been measured against the ground, and the ground keeps answering. Troy's 9 cities, stacked where an overlooked amateur said they would be. A drowned harbor off Djerba, misread elephant skulls on Sicily, a giant-built temple on Gozo older than the pyramids, a naval city beneath Corfu with its destruction recorded in the sediment. The line between myth and history has moved, and it moved because people trusted the poem enough to test it. The Odyssey was never a map of where a hero sailed, but it appears to be a record of a real world, its trade routes, its seafarers, and even its fossils, folded into story and carried forward for 3,000 years. The oldest question, whether a man named Odysseus ever lived, stays out of reach. And the one island that could answer it remains contested ground, its sediment still largely unread.